Hello and welcome to this edition of Books at Berklee. My name is Heather Reid and I am the Dean of Libraries at Berklee. And I'm thrilled to be speaking today with Panos Panay and Michael Hendrix about their new book, Two Beats Ahead: What Musical Minds Teach Us About Innovation. Panos Panay is a Cyprus-born entrepreneur, executive, and artist. He is also a Berklee grad. He is currently serving as Berklee's Senior Vice President for Global Strategy and Innovation, and is also the founding Executive Director of Berklee's Institute for Creative Entrepreneurship. Panos also founded the online platform Sonic Bids. Michael Hendrix is partner and global design director at IDEO, a global design company committed to creating positive impact. As a member of IDEO's senior executive team, he works with studio leaders and teams to advance IDEO's creative culture and world-class design capabilities. Thanks to both of you for being here today and taking the time to talk with me. I'd like to kick things off with a question for you, Panos. Since you returned to Berklee in 2014, you've really been laser focused on helping Berklee students to craft creative careers. So I'd like to ask you, what is the most important message that you would like a Berklee student to take away from your book?
The biggest message is that ultimately there does not need to be a false dichotomy between your creative self and, let's say, your career or your quote unquote business self. That ultimately the very skills, the very instincts and mindsets that you have as an expressive musician or performer or creator or dancer or artist, those are the very same mindsets that you can apply onto your career journey. In the book, we talk about mindsets like good listening, collaboration, the ability to connect, the ability to synthesize disparate concepts, reinvent yourself, remix old things to create something new. You do this as an artist and a creator and a musician every single day of your life. So rather than seeing the two, I'll use the word personas of yourself as separate, just see them as one and the same, and just trust your own creative instincts.
That's great. And Michael, I'd like to sort of turn the question to you and ask the same thing from the context of the business leaders that you work with, and what's the biggest message you would like them to take away from this book?
I want business leaders to recognize that they have this creative capacity, and that the people they admire from the entertainment industry, from the arts, are actually not just role models in their creativity because of the art itself, but because of the mindsets they bring to the world. And it's something that we can all tap into. So as Panos was saying, I think musicians, dancers, anyone in the creative professions has been put into situations where they've had to develop these characteristics more rapidly, where you're forced to collaborate sooner, you're forced to be more vulnerable sooner, you have to be inspiring on demand, all of those things that we know. They're not different than what we need in the business world. And certainly that's the message I would love for people to take away, is that it's not a metaphorical example we're saying is like, hey, be like a musician, or we are actually saying you have the same capacity, and it's here to unlock.
Yeah, that's great. So you quote Justin Timberlake as saying that the sort of one cardinal rule he has when he goes in the studio is dare to suck. And I love that. And I saw a kind of synergy between that idea and something that Imogen Heap says when you talk to her in the book, which is that she does her very best work when she takes on something that truly scares her. And it seemed to me there's a bit of an idea lurking there in both of those things about kind of putting yourself back into being in the position of a beginner or a novice, and kind of setting your expertise aside almost and letting yourself kind of, not be the expert. And I wondered if that's something that resonates for you with regard to those two artists and what they said. And I was also curious, from the perspective of, say, again, Berklee students who are really working to become experts. How do you advise them to kind of set that aside and take on that kind of vulnerability and beginner mindset again?
You have to intentionally put yourself in situations where you're in fact not an expert in a peculiar way to gain competency in life and across multiple areas and disciplines, which one needs to do today. You, in fact, have to purposely put yourself in situations where you are the least knowledgeable person in the room. And there's something about this act of both terror and bravery that keeps your mind very focused and very alert. And even on a personal situation, I recently decided to pursue an executive MBA. And I've had many people say, you of all people are going to do an MBA or an executive MBA. What do you have to learn? And I think the minute you find yourself thinking that you have nothing to learn, that's when you know that you're looking at things the wrong way, because there's always something to learn. And that quote you mentioned from Justin Timberlake about daring to suck, or Imogen Heap sort of putting herself in situations where she's truly scared, I think is so appropriate, because the only way to get better at anything is just to try it. I was, in fact, just having a conversation with a colleague, and I said, the only way you get better at decision making is just to make a lot of decisions. And you're going to get some wrong and you're going to get some right. That's the only way you improve. The only way to get better as a musician is just to keep working at it. The only way to get better as an entrepreneur is just to keep at it. In the book, we also talk about Max Martin, the songwriter and producer, who said to Justin, the only way you write a hit song is just to keep writing. So that's the advice. Keep learning, keep putting yourself in situations where you are the least smart person in the room, and you will have a joyful life and a content life.
Yeah, I think another interesting facet of that is we often think about our expertise in terms of the hard skills that we have that we can, deliver on. But what we learned in talking to Imogen or Justin or really any of the artists in the book is that there's an expertise that underlies that allows them to take the risks. And it's really what Panos is talking about. It's this embrace of the process and a confidence in the experience that you have, that that as you embark in these new spaces that you don't understand, that you don't have the knowledge about, you have a confidence in the process itself, in that you will gain knowledge, you will contribute something new, you will be able to look at it from another perspective, and that will unlock something for somebody else. So I do think they do value that deep experience, that deep life experience they've developed, even when they're running with scissors, so to speak.
Right. Yeah. So
it's also, Heather, a very helpful muscle that one is developing that eventually contributes towards one's own ability to reinvent themselves when that reinvention is called for. And certainly us going through COVID right now, we're all asked to reimagine and reinvent who we are, because a crisis is forced upon us. And I will use the example of this book. Before we wrote this book, Michael and I didn't know how to write a book. Before I went to Berklee, I had no idea how to develop a curriculum or a minor or work in an academic environment. And before I started Sonic Bids, I had no idea how to run an online business. Heck, I didn't even know how to code. And before I was a talent agent, I had never booked an artist in my life. And on and on and on. You can reverse your life and you figure that everything you do today, you once did not know how to do. But if you develop this ability to jump into situations where you don't know how to do whatever you're asked to do, then you develop these mechanisms of learning how to learn that are then applicable in so many other ways. You also begin to realize that your identity should not be tied up in any particular persona or set of expertise that you're accumulating, that you should be just as willing to give that up and move on to the next thing. And I feel that creates a level of spiritual and mental flexibility that develops resilience among creative people. And for us, the people that we admire, and we even talk in the book, especially in the chapter about reinvention, somebody like David Bowie, I think exemplify that. The constant curiosity to learn, the bravery to jump into doing things that they don't really know how to do, and the trust that somehow they're going to go through a process that's going to eventually just lead them in whatever direction it's meant to lead them, whatever that may be. But wherever they land, that's where they were supposed to be all along.
And I'm curious, you touched there, Panos, on the fact that really this is a whole new enterprise for you and Michael, taking on this project of creating a book. And I'm curious how your own collaboration in this project worked.
Well, it was a winding road, really.
Long and winding road? Or?
Yeah, exactly. We had some false starts when, I didn't want to get involved at the beginning. Actually, and Panos convinced me to come back in. We had collaborators along the way. We had because we never wrote a book, we certainly didn't know how to write even in our own voice, let alone two voices. So we ended up with different writers along the way to help us figure out what's a single voice for two people, and how do we do that in a way that is actually interesting to read, which is a challenge.
Certainly is.
Thank you. So, we needed to bring in other partners all along. And then Panos and I have different ways of working. Panos tends to get his ideas out quickly verbally. I tend to get my ideas out in writing. And so we, the way we have to work together, in fact, we were just working on something this week, post-book, or something we're writing together, which is basically, it works out better for us to Zoom together like this, record the conversation, and then I can go back into it and start to say, okay, here's some interesting ideas. And so I think we've learned how to play to each other's strengths. I think we've learned in knowing each other's strengths, it's been easier to bring other collaborators in too along the way to help us at different points. And it's a lot like, it is a lot like an ensemble where, everybody has an instrument they play. When to take the lead, when to follow based upon whatever the need is in the moment. It's just taken us a while to get the feel for that, even though we had worked together for a couple of years, actually, through consulting agreements, through co-founding a foundation, an institute together. So it wasn't that we were unfamiliar with each other, but when it came down to okay, now it's you and I doing it. It's not you and I building teams together. We just had to figure out which instruments each other played and what we brought to the creative process together.
I joked the other day with some interviewer. I said, we're a bit like Lennon and McCartney. So every song carries the joint moniker, right?
Right.
But there's parts of the book that Michael wrote and parts of the book that I wrote, but it's our joint creation. It's similar to the way that the two of those guys wrote some songs is one person's contribution, another is another, but it's ultimately the combination of the two that made that group, the Beatles, so powerful, right? Along with the other two folks. So it's been, again, part of the fundamental element that needs to always be present in these partnerships, I should say relationship more than a partnership, is trust. And it's not just on a basic level, well, I trust you're not going to run away with this, or you're not going to do this or that, but it's more the trust of what you bring to the table and what I bring to the table, that they're different, but they're of equal value in whichever way that may be. Even in these interviews, there's days where I'm off and Michael is on. There's days where Michael is off and I'm on. And I think that trust that you're going to be there for each other, that your contribution is equally valuable, just very different, is critical in any creative journey or business journey, which in the book we're arguing a business journey is a creative journey in itself. You're just creating something different than a song.
Yeah. It's all creative, right? This exercising the same muscle.
Yeah. And hopefully that's what people get from the book. One worry we've had is that, because we have music in the, 2 beats ahead, music in the subtitle, that people will just go, oh, it's a book about music, and then walk on. And what we're really trying to say is it's about musical minds and how you can unlock the potential of that for yourself, right? No matter who you are, even if you don't play a note, right? But if you do play a note, also you too, right? Because that's the idea of the book. It's like, this is something about the human creative process. Music is just a wonderful, wonderful way to help people understand it and see it illustrated, and then unlock it.
I'd like to come back to something I think that we've touched on that was another major theme in the book, which is this idea of sort of gardening versus architecture. That was something that really struck me as I was reading the book. I was really interested in that. And, in several of the interviews in the book, there's this notion being emphasized of sort of discovery versus building, right? And Bjork talks in terms of intuition and trusting your gut. Hank Shockley talks about surrender versus control, right? When he's in the studio and working. I thought that was really interesting. And, one of the things that struck me about this is that, this approach, this sort of building, nurturing versus nurturing, discovery, caring, allowing others to flourish, that is talked about a lot in the book in terms of teamwork and collaboration, in a lot of ways really focuses on traits that often are deprecated in our society and not really given a lot of value compared to the sort of building, the soul genius, the kind of forging your own path. And maybe even, I think from some perspectives, could be seen as sort of feminine traits, right? And I was curious, what your thoughts are on that, and if that kind of sort of deprecating, if you will, of the very character traits or skills that you see as most valuable here for collaboration, if that's an idea that resonates with you, or that you've encountered in talking with people about this work.
There's a quote I think we ended up, through our editing, we just ended up taking it out of the book because it was too long, but it was from Bjork, and she talks about how merging is a strength. To your point, she calls it a feminine strength, this ability to merge with another person and create something new. And absolutely throughout the book, that is an idea that you see weaving throughout. We actually quote her. I think one of the subtitles of the chapters is "Merge to Make." You just don't see it in the rest of the chapter because we edited it out. But but absolutely, that is the idea. I mean, Brian Eno as well talked about surrender, who also brought up the gardening, the architecture, and I agree. I think we have been taught for a long time that there are certain constructs of domination and winning, and we emphasize competition, but we don't believe those are really healthy ideas, at least. Definitely not in the creative space. I would argue probably broadly outside the creative space, but in our world, in our book, they're not healthy ways to work with other people. They don't bring the best out of each other. They don't lead to new ideas. They often are more destructive mentalities than they are generative mentalities. And really, we want to really focus on the true definition of the word creative, this idea of making something new. And I love that you nailed that. You found a gem in the book that goes throughout.
And think how much resistance we put up in our lives every day, in something that somebody tells us, an experience. I think because as humans, we're conditioned to crave certainty, because somehow that gives us security, then we tend to put up a lot of resistance in anything that challenges that certainty. And that holds us back from experiencing something different, something new, a breakthrough of sorts. So this idea of acceptance, of surrendering, is really powerful, because it's only when you do that you truly have breakthroughs and experiences that otherwise you'd have never had. And it can be very practical in the resistance that we put up in, say, trying a new restaurant, a new food item, reading a new book that's outside of a normal comfort zone. Or it can be in the way that ideas are shared. And we spend so much time sometimes even in the business sense or the managerial sense of defending so much our own idea that we don't pay attention to what the other person is saying. And that's a form of resistance, right? We're so busy protecting what we believe that we don't even listen to what the other person is bringing. But when you surrender, when you accept, then that's when your idea and my idea somehow, paraphrase Bjork and our chapter title, you merge to make.
Yeah, I had a mentor at IDEO tell me once, it was early in my career at IDEO, and she just, anytime you move into a new culture, a new situation, there's a lot that's unfamiliar to you. And the natural instinct is often, as Panos is saying, to be defensive, like, well, that's new, I don't know, I disagree, whatever. And she just said, you're running into a lot of new ideas. Whenever you feel that defensiveness, note it, and then instead replace it with curiosity. And it was such good advice for me. I've because throughout your life you just run into new things all the time, and you don't, it's I think must be some kind of natural self-protection to say, oh, it's too much, I don't know, I can't process it yet, but if you can lean into those moments with questions, you learn, you discover, you grow. And I hope a lot of that comes through in the book, that a musician's mind, we believe, is one that looks for opportunity in things rather than trying to shut things down. So the first chapter, listening, it's there's an example of Bjork again, who is inspired by the harbor in Reykjavik, where some people might hear noise pollution, she hears music. And it's a very direct idea, but that I think it illustrates it nicely, because it's a perspective of living that asks, what could that be? Oh, that's interesting. Can I learn more about that? That's what inspiration is, really, right? That's when we get inspired. And that's again, outside of the music world, that's available to everybody. It's just a shift in the way you see the world.
Yeah, that actually brings to mind a quote I just loved in the book, for probably obvious reasons, which was T-Bone Burnett, who said, the more well-read you are, the more you'll understand the creative process, right? And the more insight you'll have. And that really struck me. I heard, interesting enough, so T-Bone Burnett, obviously a famous record producer. I heard something really similar from Hank Shockley, another producer, engineer, and musician, who features a lot in the book. He also gave a talk at the Berklee Library a few years ago, and I have to say, a little bit to my surprise, said to the students, listen, you've got a library here. You should be using this library and reading as much as you possibly can, because the more you read and understand what came before you, the better of an artist you will be. And needless to say, as a librarian, both of those sentiments from T-Bone Burnett and Hank Shockley are kind of music to my ears, if you will. And, I think you are both avid readers, right? And now you've written this book. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of where you see reading fitting into your own creative lives, both as artists and as entrepreneurs.
I don't think I could be alive if I stopped reading. I mean, it's my oxygen in every way. It's where I get courage, inspiration, imagination, humor, grief, amusement, anger, pain. It's all in there. And I personally dedicate easily 1 to 2 hours a day reading. And I've not stopped since I was a child. And frankly, it was always an aspiration of mine to write a book, because I know the influence that that reading books has had on me as a young person. And all I'm personally hoping with this book is that somebody somewhere will be reading this book and get an epiphany or an inspiration point or the courage to do something more than what they're currently doing right now. But case in point, as I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, that I decided to enroll into an executive MBA, and it's a joint program between Brown University and a business school in Madrid called Instituto de Empresa. And I love the fact that you're learning about concepts that normally are taught in isolation, social sciences and business, in the same context, because they're not separate. They are two sides of the same coin. And when you start understanding, for example, how business constructs evolved within certain societal conditions, it makes you a better thinker. It makes you able to see situations in a different way, that sometimes what you may think is a business challenge is a psychological issue. What you may think is a moral issue ends up being an economic incentive issue, on and on. So you tend to see the world less so in boxes and defined colors. But frankly, I think you get to see it for all that it is, in all of its beauty and all of its challenges and all of its ugliness sometimes. But that's what makes us alive and human. And I think the best artists for me are the ones that are what T-Bone and Hank are talking about. I mean, what is art ultimately? I mean, for me, it's capturing or expressing a concept, an idea, and it is about pushing buttons and advancing thoughts and emotions. But it's so powerful precisely because of that last word. Unlike other forms, music has the ability to touch us in an emotional way that steers us into action one way or another. So I think that I would encourage any young person who's viewing this, and certainly any Berklee student, to not be so maniacally focused on just becoming an expert on your instrument or your major or whatever that may be, but that you will in fact be better at what you're doing if you look outside of what you're doing.
I remember being surprised when T-Bone said that when he started working with Alison Krauss, he gave her Sophocles to read. And then he said he gives most people Sophocles to read when they first work with him. And, But for him, I mean, he really, and I think we all as creators believe that getting deep into the human experience, the way we reason, the way we work through our emotions is really what art's about. And so his belief is that, you know, the more you look at that from different angles, the better you'll be able to express yourself as an artist, you know. And hopefully, I think what we all want as creators is to connect with people. You know, we want to share an idea, but I think we also want to not feel alone. You know, I mean, there's this funny thing about being an artist where I think most artists feel alone, and it's ridiculous because there's millions of artists. And yet there's something about feeling alone, and it drives your creativity to connect with others, right? And that's what, you know, is part of the joy. So, you know, literature helps us understand the human condition, you know, and that's part of writing good songs too. There's an example, Desmond Child is in the book, you know, an amazing, great songwriter for decades now. And, you know, he tells a story about growing up. His mother was a poet. He grew up listening to her. When he started writing songs, you know, at first when you read the story, you see that he's writing titles of songs, and then he kind of works up the verses from that. But as you like look at his songs and you see what he's done, what he's actually done is he comes up with a really clever title, but then he somehow gets into like the heart of, it's usually falling in love or breaking up. I mean, you look at most of the songs, it's usually what it's about. Right. I mean, it's like a fundamental human experience, but he's so good at cleverly telling those stories again. That's what's happening. So the more we can expose ourselves to other people's arts, just the better artists we become.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Well, thanks for a couple of good plugs for the library there.
Well, I will admit that when I was a student at Berklee, my favorite place to go and hang out was the library, and that's where, especially being an immigrant to the U.S. and not having had access at the time to so much music and literature, it was my well, right? It was where I got my water. And what Michael just mentioned about T-Bone giving what we say in Greek Sophocles, I think it's really important because it is all about understanding, or we will never understand, but the effort to understand the world around us, it makes us better artists.
That sort of brings to mind for me actually something that Susan Rogers, faculty member in the MP&E department at Berklee, and Prince's previous sound engineer. So something that she said in the book, which I don't know, I think might perhaps be a surprise to some non-artists, is she said, a life in the arts is a life of problem solving. And that in that sense, it's very similar to a life in business. And, you know, I think some people might be surprised to hear that. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit and how you see problem solving and the arts as being connected.
Well, I think of a, I guess first at a very general level, it's the ability to take an idea that's interesting to you and make it an idea that's interesting to many people. And that's actually quite hard. That's very hard. It's the kind of problem to solve in which you're bringing tangibility to an idea so other people can interact with it and enjoy it or share it or build on it, etc. So, you know, it's a skill. I mean, you meet people all the time that say, oh, I've got, you know, I'm full of ideas all the time. And yet like they don't do anything, right? And it has no impact in the world. So that's to me the first fundamental of that problem solving idea, is to be able to take it from, oh, I've got an idea and then make it something that you're interested in. That is quite a problem to solve.
Yeah.
Well, it goes back to this building off of what you were saying, Michael, like this desire to capture lightning in a bottle, right? And this desire to figure out the best way to express something, figure out the best way to connect with somebody, figure out the best way to articulate a concept, figure another way of articulating a concept, or taking multiple concepts and putting them together and see if you can come up with yet another thing. So it is about constantly posing questions and attempting to answer them, or just reveling in the posing of the question and letting others answer it, or letting others answer it in any which way they think is appropriate without determining what the right answer is. And great lyricists for me do that. I love when songwriters are asked to explain their lyrics and they don't. Because that lyric means something to me and it means something very different to you, and it's okay. I do not want to know what inspired them to write those lyrics, because that takes away the magic of what that means. So you're problem solving in that way, or you're posing questions for others to problem solve. Or if you're an engineer, you're trying to capture somebody else's creation in a way that resonates with the intention of that creation, right? And in its most minuscule way, it's maybe trying to capture the perfect drum sound, the perfect gated reverb effect, the perfect setting up of a microphone in a studio to just capture the rawness of intention of an artist. Or in an abstract sense, it's all about, how do I communicate this? And it's an endless drive. I think that's what drives us. It's this endless drive to solve the problems, which are infinite, but you're looking at it from a positive way rather than from a defensive or negative way or a frustrating way. I mean, we go back to enjoy the process. Enjoy the process. It's you will never solve all the problems, if you will. You will never be able to capture every idea exactly the way that's in your head. But maybe in the process of trying to capture that idea and being open that it may manifest in a very different way than you had in mind, that's the idea you wanted to express all along. So
yeah. Yeah, and you put it that way, Panos, it does sound, I mean, what you're describing there is so similar to what goes on in any business environment, right? Very similar, which then makes me think about something else that Hank Shockley says in the book, which is that he says, you know, the business world doesn't understand creatives and creatives don't understand the business world. And, you know, your book is really, in a sense, kind of, you know, flying in the face of that somewhat, right? And trying to bring these two sides together. And in fact, saying, you know what, like there's not a chasm to cross here, right? That these two, I don't want to say sides, because from the perspective of your book, they're not different sides at all. They're really very similar. So how do you convince business people that they're really not so far apart from creatives, and vice versa? What are some of the sort of tools or tricks that you've been able to use to actually break through in that mindset?
You can resort to gimmicks, but I'm not a fan of gimmicks. So putting people together in a drum circle to prove to them that they're creative, I mean, that's fine. But really, the only thing, in my view, that distinguishes us from other animals on this planet is that one thing, our creativity and our imagination. But everything we do is a product of our ability to imagine first and then create. So anybody who's started a business knows that it is by nature a creative attempt. I mean, it's embedded right there. You are creating a business. Science is the daring of creativity to try and explain something. Mathematics is creativity expressed in a different language, right? I know you laugh, but accounting is storytelling. It's just a storytelling using a different language. And it's just as subjective, in spite of our belief that just because it involves numbers, there is a utter subjectivity to it. Any accountant will tell you that accounting is just subjective as any other form of narrative telling. So I feel that it's just a lens, it's a viewpoint. And my view is that everything is creative. And the dichotomy that we attempt to put between the two is false. And just as much as art is science, and art is commerce, and commerce is art too, right? So what binds all these? Our shared humanity. That's it. We're all humans. Everything else we put on top of that humanity is just an identity and a persona that we tell ourselves we are, or somebody else tells us we are. But why not? How many accountants do you know who paint? Is it two different people? I don't know if many painters are accountants, but that's a different story.
It's funny you say that, because I have a client, Panos, that works at Bain Capital, and I was noticing on the Zoom call the other day that he was painting wildlife behind his desk. He had a easel up and a canvas, and halfway done painting. And I had no idea that he was a regular painter, but I think it's absolutely spot on. I mean, the best thing to do is just invite people into your creative process. Like, again, in the book, Steve Stout talks about this. He says in his company, people have majors and minors. The major is the job title you have. The minor is your passion. And so when he's putting together teams to work on things, he looks at the minors too, because, you may not know anything about coding, but maybe you know something about hip hop. And so he's going to put you in on that team to contribute. And if you can think about your network that way, don't think about the job titles people have, think about the passions people have. You can invite them in to work with you on whatever's appropriate, wherever you believe they'll be able to, be a collaborator. And that's an exciting new way to work. That means, when you're writing a song, you don't need to necessarily write it with songwriters or other musicians. You can invite other people in, because there's something about their creativity, their life experience, that could be additive to what you're doing.
Yeah.
And the same is true in the business world. We encourage, there's an idea in the business world. You have different departments. You have this idea of cross-functional teams. So that means a team built from the multiple departments. But I find even that limiting, because it's still using that mental model of, we've drawn these lines within our organization. And the best creative teams are the teams you organize within the company where people are most motivated, and their passions are usually what's motivating them. It's not their job titles. So when you can put together teams like that, you usually come up with new ideas faster, and you get things out into the market faster.
Yeah. I love that idea of the major minor in the book. I thought that's just really interesting idea. So I'm glad you brought that up. So we are nearly out of time. We've only got 3 minutes. So maybe this would be a good note to end on. I really appreciate you both taking the time to do this, and I've really enjoyed it. I wonder, just maybe as a final note, which we may or may not include in the final edit, like one thing I'm curious about is, to release a book like this at this point in time, in the midst of this pandemic that we find ourselves in. Do you think that is it amplifying the message of the book in any way? How is it affecting the message of the book? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I could tell you that was predetermined, but we started this process 3 years ago, and the publication date of the book was set a year and a half ago or more. So I wish I could tell you were these, geniuses who perfectly timed this, but I think that's the premise of the book. Just things happen. Be open to them. For us, maybe what's resonating about the messages in the book and the era that we're in is that I do believe that to solve these difficult challenges we're facing as a society right now, you need creativity. You need a different way of thinking. You need a different framework. Many of our frameworks are based in a bygone era, in an era of industrialization, of certainty, of machinery, of assembly lines. And now we're finding ourselves in a very different era with problems that are of a different nature. They're both old and new. And we think that these mindsets of musicians can be applicable or ought to be considered as applicable as a new framework of seeing opportunities, problem solving, as we were talking about earlier, connecting, collaborating, imagining, inspiring. But also, maybe the most important thing is the daring to reinvent ourselves, reinvent our communities, reinvent the systems that are beginning to let us down because they're just past their due date. So that's what we're hoping that the book will do. Promote a conversation more than anything else. Is all we want, to promote a conversation about the value of a creative education like the one that we are giving at Berklee, and to have a seat at the same table as the one that science and technology and mathematics and engineering pulled up against to have that meal. So we want creativity to be at that table.
Well said, Panos.
Yes, I think that's a great note to end on. It's great.